Our next adventure in California studies has to do with what we call the roots of reform in late 19th, early 20th century California. Rawls and Mead look at this rather interestingly, and they say that in retrospect, between the time of the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the progressive movement, as it was so called, in the early 1900s, cities, corporations, and labor unions grew so rapidly that government and law could not keep up with the pace, just couldn't keep up with them. At this time, the so-called city boss evolved during this period of time as kind of an extra legal figure who would be the bridge between politics and business. The boss essentially served as a broker unofficially in a corrupt system of alliances between the two. One of the most famous early 20th century bosses in California history was Abraham Rueff, who became a city boss in San Francisco and was called Boss Rueff, in fact. He was the son of a moderately wealthy San Francisco family. He entered politics as an idealistic young reformer. He'd been to law school and all of that, but he saw the reality of machine rule when he attended his first Republican Party convention. He became a Republican sub-boss for a district in the northern part of the city of San Francisco. After Mayor Phelan used city police to aid strikebreakers in the dock strike in 1901, as I mentioned before, kind of a fleeting reference, unions started to get into politics because they figured they wanted to get a piece of the action to promote their issues. So they formed the Union Labor Party. Now, while Rueff had no particular affinity for the unions, he felt that he could use them to get candidates that he chose elected to office. So Phelan, by this point, as a mayor of San Francisco, was pretty well washed up politically. Neither major party at the time were running viable candidates to replace him. So Rueff chose a friend of his, Eugene Schmitz, as the Union Labor candidate. Schmitz was elected mayor of San Francisco in 1901. 1903 and in 1905. And in 1905, the Union Labor Party swept all 18 positions on the San Francisco County Board of Supervisors. The new supervisors, however, made Rueff share his so-called fees with them. Here's the deal. Rueff collected, as a lawyer, fees from businesses and people in order to make sure that their interests were protected at City Hall. And the newly elected supervisors pretty much expected that Rueff would split those fees with them. This was very common practice at that time. There were two great earthquakes in San Francisco in 1906. There was the geologic one, which we'll talk about here. Wednesday morning, April 18th, 1906, at 5:14 in the morning, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake hit. That's estimated based on today's scales. They didn't have those kind of earthquake scales in those days. It ruptured the San Andreas Fault all the way from San Juan Bautista, east of Monterey, to Cape Mendocino, way up in the north. There were hundreds of fires in San Francisco as a result of broken gas mains and also inadequate water to fight the fires because of a flimsy water system in San Francisco. It's often said that there were 700 deaths in this earthquake, but recent research actually puts the death toll at about 3,000. So there's just a little bit about the San Francisco earthquake and fire of April 18th, 1906. Now, here's the other San Francisco earthquake of 1906. It was a graft prosecution. A small group of reformers began in very close secrecy before the earthquake to actually plan and execute an investigation of the corruption of city government in San Francisco. An announcement of the beginning of the investigation was made in October of 1906. The originator of the plan was a guy named Fremont Older. He was the editor of the San Francisco Bulletin, one of the newspapers in San Francisco. Federal prosecutor Francis J. Haney first charged Boss Rueff and Schmitz, the new mayor, with the charge of extorting money from the owners of so-called French restaurants. What was a French restaurant? Well, on the bottom floor of the restaurant, there were moderately priced, high-quality meals that were served. It was a high-class restaurant. In the upper floors, well, there were kind of houses of ill repute, along with even fancier food. Investigator William Burns was able to trap a county supervisor into taking a planted bribe, kind of a sting operation. That supervisor was offered immunity from prosecution in return for complete disclosure of getting these bribes from these so-called French restaurants. All the other supervisors also confessed. They were also offered immunity. Rueff confessed, and he offered immunity. He was offered immunity as well if he testified against the higher ups, meaning the owners of the big businesses and so on. The prosecution eventually went after the executive of United Railroads. That was the company that owned the electric rail cars in the city of San Francisco. At that point, Rueff refused to testify against United Railroads because it was going to bite the hand that fed him with respect to bribes. Haney revoked the immunity promise, and then Rueff was convicted and served time in San Quentin. Mayor Schmitz was convicted in one of the French restaurant cases, and he was not put in jail, but he was removed from office. At this point, by 1909, the support for the prosecution started to wane. Investigations were discontinued in 1909. There's a picture of Fremont Older, who started the whole thing. In Los Angeles, meanwhile, there was a movement called the Good Government Movement that started. Southern Pacific had become so influential in Southern California by the early 1900s that even conservative newspaper publisher Harrison Gray Otis felt that the railroad needed constraints. So reformers of all different stripes started popping up on the scene. Some were political and moral, and some were social and economic. It was difficult to bridge the gaps between these reformers, the Otis empire of the LA Times, and the labor unions. So there was this Los Angeles physician by the name of Dr. John Randolph Haynes. He was actually instrumental in bridging these disparate groups in Los Angeles. LA adopted to its city charter in 1903 the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. It was really revolutionary in governance of any political entity at the time, let alone a city. It was the first provision for the recall in any governmental unit in the world, and the first adoption of the initiative in the referendum by a city. So this is quite significant. Dr. Haynes led a recall effort against LA City Councilman J.R. Davenport in 1904 because Davenport voted to award a public printing contract to the LA Times when other bids were actually lower. The recall effort against Davenport was successful, and so Harrison Gray Otis got ticked off, and he suspended his support for the Good Government League. This led to Otis's newspaper competitor, a guy by the name of Edwin T. Earle, who published the LA Express, to support the reform candidates. This is a picture of Dr. John Randolph Haynes, which is courtesy of an outfit, a nonprofit in LA called the West Adams Heritage Association. That's the name of a neighborhood southwest of downtown LA. It's a preservation society. The aforementioned Earle hired journalist Edward A. Dixon to write editorials denouncing the power of the railroads in his newspaper, the LA Express. This led to the formation of the Nonpartisan Committee of 100, a political reform group. Most of the members of the nonpartisan group were Republicans, and reform-minded Republicans were concerned that Democrats would gain leadership of the so-called reform movement and capture control of state government. However, Republicans influenced by the railroads were in the majority of that party at the time in 1906, especially when Boss Rueff dominated up in San Francisco. And then came from all of this another reform group called the Lincoln Roosevelt League. There was a guy named James N. Gillette. He was the Republican candidate for governor in 1906. He was picked with railroad influence. The Democrats had a chance of winning the governor's race that year with their candidate, Theodore Bell from Napa. He was a reformer. However, there was a spoiler in this election. William Randolph Hearst, remember him, the publisher? He sponsored a third-party movement called the Independence League. This took votes away from the reform-minded Bell, who then lost the election to Gillette, who was the guy who was the Republican candidate handpicked by the railroads. In 1907, then, Dr. Haynes, as a result, urged his reformers to expand their success in Los Angeles to the state level to fight the railroad again. The Los Angeles Express correspondent Dixon, aforementioned, went to Sacramento in January 1907 to cover the new legislative session up there. At that point, Dixon had a chance meeting with a guy named Chester H. Rowell, here's the Fresno connection, editor of the newspaper called the Fresno Morning Republican. Yes, there were two newspapers around the time of the turn of the century. there was a Fresno Bee and there was a Fresno Morning Republican. It was apparent to both men that the California legislature of 1907 pretty much remained beholden to the railroads at this point in time. So these two men, Dixon and Rowell, agreed to start a new reform movement in California, and they sent letters to reform-minded Republicans, especially newspaper editors throughout the state, to gin up some support. A Southern California group met on May 21, 1907 in L.A. and adopted Dixon's suggestion of the name Lincoln Republicans for the new reform group, because, of course, the Republican Party had great respect for Abraham Lincoln, the president from a half-century before. A larger statewide group met in Oakland about 3 months later and adopted the name of the League of Lincoln Roosevelt Republican Clubs, which was a compromise with the former government prosecutor we mentioned in the previous chapter, Francis Haney, of the San Francisco graft corruption fame. So now we have the Lincoln Roosevelt Republican Reformers. And here is a picture of Edward A. Dixon on the right, which, by the way, he was responsible for the founding of UCLA and served on the University of California Board of Regents for something like 40 years. And Chester Rowell, who was that publisher of the Fresno Republican, the Morning Republican, and also was mayor of Fresno for a little bit of time. On the corner of Tulare and Van Ness Streets in downtown Fresno, there is a building named after Rowell. In 1908, reformers were able to elect enough members to the legislature to make it possible for the enactment of a direct primary law in 1909, so no longer did party bosses pick primary candidates. Now, people in the public got to vote for who wanted to run and who was going to run for the main candidates for their party's offices. By 1910, nominations for state office were then taken away from the machine-driven politics of the railroads, and now the search was on for an appropriate candidate for governor of the reform movement ilk. Initially, it was thought that Haney would be the one that would run for governor in 1910, but he was in a long recuperation from a gunshot wound that was inflicted on him in 1908 by a disgruntled prospective juror in the Rueff trial. Remember Rueff, the guy that served time in San Quentin? So there was a guy named Hiram Johnson, who was one of Haney's special assistants in the DA's office in San Francisco. Now, Johnson was reluctant to run for governor since his father, Grove Johnson, an assemblyman from Sacramento, was pretty much entrenched in the Southern Pacific political machine at the time. However, Hiram Johnson did agree to run, and he won in August of 1910 the Republican nomination for the governorship, and Theodore Bell of the Democrats was the nominee for that party. The Southern Pacific supported Bell because they thought he was the least of the evils of the reformers, but Hiram Johnson did win that election in 1910 as the Republican governor of California. So interesting politics in California in the first 10 years of the 20th century.